All right, let's look at how taxes affect total surplus. First, we're going to begin with a market graph where we are reminding ourselves of the concepts of consumer surplus and producer surplus. So we're in a competitive market. The equilibrium price is P star, equilibrium quantity is Q star, and in an efficient market, consumer and producer surplus is maximized, and consumer surplus represents the area from the price line up to the demand curve. That's the blue shaded triangle. And then the lower triangle from the price line down to the supply curve represents producer surplus. So now, if we've got a tax in the market, how is that going to impact the distribution of surplus, right? So in a competitive market, total surplus is maximized, but if there's going to be a tax, let's see what's going to happen. So if we draw another graph, we're going to see that taxes create a wedge between the price the buyers pay and the price the seller receives. So PB, price paid by the buyer, minus the amount that the sellers receive, PS, that's going to equal the tax per unit. Now, graphically, let's put our opening equilibrium in, P star, Q star, and then let's say that the government decides to implement a tax. So they're going to implement this range on a per unit basis. That's the vertical gap that you see between PB and PS. That's the amount of tax per unit. So on the demand curve, the buyers are paying this higher price, and therefore the quantity that they demand is going to be smaller, and the sellers at the same time are going to get a lower price, so they're not going to want to supply as many units at that lower price because there's this gap going to the government. So this tax wedge gets created, and we see this little yellow triangle now. The equilibrium quantity, Q star, is a bigger amount than the quantity with the tax. So that yellow triangle, that represents lost areas of consumer and producer surplus. We would call that DWL, dead weight loss from the tax. And the gap between PB and PS, that's the amount of tax per unit. And if we multiply that by the quantity that we're going to see traded in the market after the tax, then that pink rectangle represents the tax revenue to the government. So PB minus PS is the tax per unit and the tax wedge, and then the tax revenue is the pink rectangle. Let's look at what this means in terms of specifics for the areas of lost consumer and producer surplus. So putting that graph together again, but now labeling the areas A, B, C, D, and E, let's think about what the situation is before there's a tax, right? So consumer surplus would be the large upper triangle, A, B, and C, and producer surplus would be the lower triangle, D, E, and F. So the pink triangle, A, B, C, was the consumer surplus before the tax, but then after the tax, all that the consumers have is just area A. And producer surplus before the tax is the big triangle, D, E, and F area in the green, but then after the tax, producers only have area F, that blue triangle. So the tax revenue again is B and D, that orange rectangle, and then the two areas of lost surplus, lost entirely to the economy, are areas C and E, or that sort of airplane wedge piece pointing to the right. Areas C and E would be the dead weight loss from the tax. So when people talk about tax efficiency, they're talking about how much dead weight loss is there. And they're also talking about how far is the distance between Q star and the quantity with the tax.